So this is the first lecture in a series of lectures on the ancient and medieval world, primarily looking at the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and Europe, with occasional forays elsewhere. This first lecture is going to primarily deal with ancient Mesopotamia during the Bronze Age. Mesopotamia is often seen as the beginning of civilization, and I want to talk about the origins of civilization here, by which I mean living in an urban society. I want to be careful with this term civilization. The word itself derives etymologically from the word for city, kiwes. And I don't mean civilization here in the more biased, pejorative sense of civilized, or rather glorifying sense of civilized, the more as being more advanced. As we shall see, there are plenty of non-city dwelling peoples who are highly sophisticated culturally. So don't think of civilized and uncivilized as good versus bad, although, as we'll talk about in this class, that is indeed exactly how many people living in Mesopotamia would have characterized the difference. We're also going to look at the geography of Mesopotamia, because that was absolutely a crucial component in this development of cities. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the Stone Age, the era in which humans developed some of their first technologies. As the name implies, the most advanced material was stone. But for millions of years, human beings wandered from place to place. That is, they were nomadic, hunting animals and gathering plants. For most of the time human beings have existed on this planet, over 1 million years, this nomadic existence was our only lifestyle. Why it came to an end is a subject of great debate, but more properly a question for an archaeology or anthropology class. Around 15,000 years ago, people began to settle down in places where food was so abundant that they didn't have to move around with the seasons. These communities were tiny, usually a few hundred people, at most a couple of thousand. Agriculture, that is, domesticating plants deliberately planted in the ground and cultivated by people, happened only a few thousand years after that. There are many theories as to why, but the current evidence from from a place that in what is today Turkey, not Mesopotamia, that we will be looking at in a minute, is that agriculture happened after settling down and giving up the nomadic lifestyle. But there could have been many reasons in many different places. Now, one theory as to why this happened is actually a climate change in the region. Less rain meant that these early communities, where there had been abundant food, had to find new ways to make enough food once the rains changed, because they had already achieved a relatively large settled population and they didn't want to go back to hunting and gathering. Now, some other recent research for why nomads settled down permanently in a few nearby locations suggests that their motivations may have been religious, that is to say, at a spot considered sacred, and so religion and settled communities go way back to the beginning. Again, these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive reasons for why people started to settle down. What I simply want to suggest is that, as with so many things in human history, the explanations usually cannot be boiled down to single answers. They're almost always more complex than that. The earliest discovered settlements along these lines developed in Anatolia, what is now called Turkey, and we're going to talk more about Anatolia, Turkey, in a few lectures and indeed for the rest of this course. However, the first place that these settlements developed into urban centers, that is what we would call cities, which show signs of deliberate planning and organization, happened along the parallel Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is today the nation of Iraq. And just to stop here for a moment, what actually constitutes a city as opposed to a town is a subject of a fierce debate. I once read a book that said, well, how am I going to define cities? As a 600-page long book where cities were an incredibly important part of the argument. This author had a 14-point set of criteria for determining what a city was. So it's very hard to say when a settlement becomes a city, but most historians argue that it first happened in Mesopotamia, that is, in ancient Greek, a term that meant the land between the two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Now, these two rivers flood, but they don't do so predictably, in contrast to the Nile that we'll be looking at in the next lecture, and they often flood violently. These rivers provide rich soil for agriculture that's left behind after these floods, but obviously also a danger. Now, organized farming to build irrigation canals to control the water makes this more efficient and marginally safer. But this required an enormous amount of labor to dig out these canals. And that enormous amount of labor required bureaucracy to organize, and that bureaucracy meant there was going to be hierarchy. Hierarchy meant some people told other people what to do and had higher status and more resources in these cities. Now, at first, it seems that these people at the top of the hierarchy were priests, people who claimed to speak on behalf of the gods, but eventually kings developed alongside priests. We'll talk more about the development and role of kings in our lecture on Egypt next time, where it actually seems to have developed a little earlier than in Mesopotamia, despite cities and urban culture starting earlier in Mesopotamia than in Egypt. Now, this hierarchy was part of a process of specialization in society. Agriculture was productive enough that not everyone needed to farm all the time in order to survive. There was a surplus of food. That meant cities could support not only political and religious leaders like kings and priests, but specialized craftsmen who could dedicate their time to making valuable commodities such as pottery, or eventually smiths who worked metals like copper and bronze. And we call this period after the Stone Age the Bronze Age because bronze technology, an alloy of copper and tin, was discovered and spread rapidly throughout the Middle East and beyond. But the development of bronze around the year 3300 BCE had very important implications economically and culturally as well as technologically. Copper and tin mines are rarely found near each other, so bronze's technological spread not only shows that people at this time were already interacting long distance, it necessitated continuous trade to bring these resources of copper and tin together. And this was particularly true for Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia is fertile in terms of food, but has very little wood or metal, or even stone. These materials were therefore prestigious, and accessing trade routes with other regions that had them, places as far away as Oman, Cyprus, India, even Afghanistan, was a way that these early rulers of these cities could show off their power and wealth. Now, we call this display of wealth to show status conspicuous consumption. So being able to show that you had bronze, which most people couldn't get a hold of because it was a rare material, was a way of showing that you were more important and had higher status in society. Now, the first truly urban civilization to arise was called Sumeria. The Sumerian language has no relationship to any other language that we know of. Sumerian was used by several different ethnic groups in southern Mesopotamia. So there's not just one Sumerian people. There were several Sumerian groups speaking the Sumerian language. They were living in the southern part, or rather the southeastern part of Mesopotamia, near what is now the Persian Gulf, and there's evidence of this going back as far as 3000 BCE. The Sumerian language, however, went extinct as a living language around 1,000 years later in 2000 BCE, although it was still a language known by educated elites until around 100 CE. Much like Latin is still a language educated people know, but is a dead language. The first city was Uruk, starting sometime around 4000 BCE as a settlement around 150 miles south of modern Baghdad in ancient Sumeria. But by around 3000 BCE, Uruk had a wall enclosing about 3.5 square miles and a population of perhaps as high as 50,000 within the city and in the surrounding area. That's incredibly small to us. For instance, the little town Idichin is a little less than 10,000 people when college is in session. But it was huge for the time and meant Uruk took food from a wide area, while people in the city could specialize in other tasks because farming was efficient enough to provide for people who didn't spend all their time farming, like craftspeople, priests, or eventually kings. And that attracted traders from further away to get the goods of these specialists for more exotic goods like the copper and tin that they needed. Uruk probably controlled at least a 4-mile radius, but Uruk had a much wider impact. Settlements were founded throughout the 4th millennium BCE and mimicked the style of Uruk, from its architecture to its pottery, as far away as Syria. So we also call this early phase of civilization the Uruk period. Uruk and the other cities of Sumer needed bureaucracies to keep track of all the food that they were producing. and the labor needed to maintain both the farming and the city, and that meant they needed to keep records. And records mean that they needed a system of writing, which they invented, the first in the world. Now, this did not happen overnight, so I can't tell you exactly the moment that writing was invented. People had been using tokens and representative objects as ways of nonverbal communication for at least 1,000 years already as part of trading to verify the number and kind of goods being shipped. Seals to mark an item as belonging to or coming from a particular person also developed well before writing. But these were pictures, kind of like how colleges each have a crest that people can recognize represents the college without any words. Now, these slowly became more abstract and evolved into the first writing system called cuneiform. The reason it's called cuneiform is that literally means in Latin wedge-shaped. And the reason for the wedges is that their writing instruments cut little wedge shapes into clay tablets to make the letters. These wedges were combined together into hundreds of distinct signs representing both sounds and whole words. So it was not an alphabet, it was a writing system. That makes it similar to what we'll look at next time with hieroglyphs. And that's part of why so much written evidence survives, actually, because these cuneiform was made with clay or stone, not by using paper. The clay was usually not baked, but actually, rather ironically, if a cuneiform library was caught in a fire, burned during the destruction of a city, then the tablet would become as durable as ceramic pottery, lasting much longer than biodegradable materials we use, like paper. It could be broken into pieces, which you can piece back together, but not. It won't break down over time. It won't rot. And there are literally thousands, tens of thousands of these tablets. So many that not all of the ones discovered have even been read. But true to their original purpose, a great many of them are essentially receipts keeping track of purchases and expenses, or for who owed and paid their taxes. Writing for other purposes like recording stories, thinking about philosophy or the gods, that only developed hundreds of years later. And that's because it's much easier to remember a story than how much you owe in taxes. And also, it's something you're probably much less likely to argue about than how much money you owe the government. It took a long time for writing to develop, and it happened in slow stages, but by about 2500 BCE, a system that we can recognize as writing had been developed fully in the area of the Uruk culture. Now, again, I want to give a distinction here. This is a writing system. It is not a language. That's not an alphabet, and it's also not a language. You can use cuneiform to write many languages. This is in the same way that I am using in this lecture, the Latin alphabet. That is an alphabet that was designed to be used with the Latin language, but is currently used to represent all kinds of languages, like English, French, German, Spanish. So keep that in mind, the distinction between a language and the alphabet used, or the alphabet or other writing system used to record it. They're not the same thing, and there are far more languages than there are writing systems. Now, Uruk was organized around temples, massive platforms made out of mud bricks. Again, there wasn't a lot of stone or wood in Mesopotamia, but they had mud and they had straw, so they could make all the bricks they wanted. And this relates to our reading for this lecture on Gilgamesh. We'll see him building cities out of mud brick and ziggurats. These ziggurats are, these temples, these ziggurats are putting a platform on top of a platform, like steps. Mesopotamia is also very flat, so these stepped pyramids, these ziggurats, would have seemed enormous, closer to heaven and thus to the gods. It was also a visual representation of hierarchy. The gods are above in heaven, the priests are between them, and the normal people in the ziggurat. Now that may seem painfully obvious, but that doesn't mean it didn't have an impact on people. People still go for obvious symbolism, and it still matters. Mesopotamia was polytheistic, meaning that they worshipped many gods, each god being responsible for some aspect of reality, like the sun or death, war, ruling, rain, etc. But every city also had a patron god or goddess as well. Uruk's patron was Inanna, later called Ishtar, for instance, a goddess of war and the morning star, that is, the planet Venus. The gods were believed to live in their temples on top of the ziggurats, which were called in ancient languages the houses of the gods. Each would have a cult statue or idol of the god, in which the deity was physically present in the temple and the priests were attendants on the god. A temple, therefore, was not like a church or a mosque. Only the priests were allowed into the holiest parts of the temple, where the statue of the god was. The temple functioned like the house of the god, with the priests as the god's servants, feeding and taking care of the god via the idol statue. The priests ate the food themselves after they offered it, or burned parts of it as an offering. Not taking care of the god would bring divine anger, and the god could then abandon the city, leaving it open to war or famine or some other disaster. And that was about it in terms of religion, too. People didn't seem to gather in the temple the way modern people gather in churches, synagogues, and mosques. Belief didn't enter into it. There wasn't an alternative to believing in, for one thing. They didn't have a scientific explanation for the universe. The gods didn't promise either a happy afterlife. Instead, people worshipped them in hopes of averting all the many possible disasters that could befall them in life. And again, if you look at the story of Gilgamesh, the idea of an afterlife there is not really a reward or a punishment. It's bad. It's just awful, but that's just the nature of the afterlife. There's not a judgment component to it. Now, these temples, usually ziggurats, owned a lot of land. Now, historians used to think that priests owned all the land via the temples, but that theory has been revised as more evidence has come to light. But the temples still controlled a lot of the economy, and that's going to be true of many societies that we look at, where religious institutions will control a lot of the wealth, primarily landed wealth, which is where all of the societies will be looking at invested their wealth. That is in land. That also made these temples very important politically. And when kings developed later, the priests and kings worked together, ideally, to run the society and owned most of the economy as well. So this is the end of the first part of our lecture on Mesopotamia, covering the sort of backgrounds to how urban civilizations developed and what these urban civilizations looked like, particularly this first urban civilization of Uruk. In the next part of the lecture, we will be looking at how this urban civilization developed into empires and how those evolved over time until the late Bronze Age collapse.